So I'm Gauri Patil, and I'm a brand woman in the field of business analytics and data science. Did that sound odd? And why did I hesitate while saying it out loud in front of large audience? If you're like me, do you also hesitate to self-identify on websites? But isn't the whole point of the self-identification that these companies provide us with inclusive environment and equitable opportunities? I tried to look at my hesitation from a data analyst perspective and found that there are three major components to it. Next slide. Data, people, us, and machines. To simply explain, we are the people, specifically data professionals in this case, feed data to the models or machines, which makes predictions. And then we or machines make decisions based on these predictions, which in turn again generates data. How is this related to my hesitation? Well, here's the catch. Next slide. Almost all the data sets generated by these systems are biased. There are many different types of biases, and we as humans pass these biases onto the data. This data then represents constructed reality and not the natural one. We as a people are at the center of it. We create the data, we train these models on machines, and we are the ones that are affected by their applications again. There is lack of diversity and inclusiveness among these professionals groups as well. 70% of data scientists are white. Only 15% of data analytics community is women, and less than 5% is Black or African Americans. The result of these applications and such models are not just inaccurate, but also harmful. Google's ad buying algorithm or portal returned adult content when searched for Black, Asian, or Latina girls, or even boys of same ethnicity. And when searched for white girls or white boys, it did not return any such results. Medical algorithm, which predicts if patients will need complex healthcare, favored white patients over sick Black patients. And the controversial facial recognition algorithm, NIST found that many algorithms falsely identify African American or Asian faces up to 10 to 100 times more than Caucasian faces. 10 to 100 times. We fear of machines taking over in the future, while in present machines have already started discriminating in harmful ways. But there's a hope. As data scientists or analytic professionals, we need to be extra careful about making this data as unbiased as possible and improve the accuracy of these models on the underrepresented groups. Year 2020 was an eye-opener and remarkable year that sparked discussions about racial equity and DEI. After the unfortunate incidents of killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and more, it created this movement where we recognize the pressing need for DEI and racial equity in all areas. Companies and people came forward with their research and documentaries. It was a year of disruption via awareness. Some of the famous works are listed here, and I urge you to take out some time and learn more about this topic. The journey to DEI is a long one, but we have made a good start, and this panel discussion is a part of it. With that being said, I would like to introduce our panel to you. Myself again, Gauri Patil. I'm an MSBA student, and I worked on an applied project for the city of Linwood in park analysis project. I got to work on demographic data in this project. I'm also a student representative for DEI Advisory Council here at Milgard's. I have today with me Jessica Schlicker, the MD and MBA, and she's a family physician and medical director for Virginia Mason Franciscan Health Mission Control and Virtual Hospital. Crystal Sosi, she's currently completing her PhD in genomics and health disparities at Vanderbilt University. She's also a founder of first US Indigenous-led biobank, the Native Biodata Consortium. I have my fellow classmate here, Lindsay Grace, who is the executive coordinator for Gender Equality Division at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And then my senior, Aaron Brown, MSBA alumni, who is a data analytics manager at Common Spirit Health and co-founder and analytics consultant at AP3 Analytics. Thank you for being here with me today. With that, Let's start with our first question. I would like you to answer in the same order, going forward with Lindsay, Crystal, going forward with Jessica, Crystal, Lindsay, and then Aaron. Tell us about your story. What was your pathway into the field of data analytics? From your perspective, what is it about you or the opportunities that you leveraged that help you overcome these odds?
Hey, I'm Jessica Schlicker. As our host mentioned, I'm a family doctor. I had been practicing as a family doctor for about 8 years and really advocating for quality of care. And I realized that it wasn't working. And so I thought, okay, well, I have to learn the language of data and the language of finance, because that's how I'm going to be able to make a greater impact for my patients. And so I went back and did night school for a year and got an MBA. I think, to me, it's not so much, all data is wrong, essentially, right? When you start looking at models, they're all wrong. But it's understanding how they're wrong and then making sure that they improve over time to make sure that we continue to improve. So at Mission Control, we can see we're kind of like air traffic control for 8 of our hospitals. And I'm sitting there right now, and we have a staff of about 60 people, and they can tell not only the patients we have now, but the patients we're going to get and what they're going to need in the future. So we try to match those needs, anticipate them, and have those resources they're going to need in advance rather than operating based on a crisis. I would say the hardest thing about being women in data is feeling guilty about my kids. I have 3 children, and I think there's a burden. I don't want to say burden. The gift of that, being a woman, I think it's very common to always feel sort of with one foot in both worlds. So I would say that's the hardest part.
Thank you for sharing that. Crystal?
Yes, everyone. Hello, I'm Dinesh Azad. I am an indigenous genomicist mostly, and bioethicist, and by nature happen to deal a lot with data. So my story is that I was actually originally a lab-based individual studying cancer, and I actually patented a couple of therapies related to early detection and imaging using ultrasonography to detect cancer. And I thought that was my trajectory. Like, I was going to become a cancer biologist and, try to understand how this variety of conditions has become so resultant in so many communities. But I actually, my attempt at a PhD in cancer biology ended very shortly because I realized that as an Indigenous person, that there really aren't that many of us in STEM fields. Like, for instance, growing up, we were taught to go to college, first of all, whatever it was that term meant, going to college. And we were encouraged to become doctors and lawyers and engineers and teachers. None of us were ever encouraged to become a scientist, because how do you, what's the conceptual framework of Western science for Indigenous communities historically? It has not been great. And then, being able to come back to our communities with a science background, how does one do that? And while I realized that there's a pyramid of you have a number of natives that are able to graduate high school and college and then go into grad school and to STEM, what would be the meaningful impact of my degree in cancer biology back to my people? And I had this harrowing realization that even if I were to spend my life developing a cancer therapy that, ameliorated cancer, would it actually affect my own people? If you think about preventative healthcare and its availability, and the availability of oncology as a subspecialty in our communities, it's such a huge structural barriers to healthcare. Would my developing the latest tier drug even trickle down to my community? Probably not, unfortunately. That's just how insurance works. I know, because I worked for an insurance company, which is in data scientist as an analyst, so that's a separate story. So I went back to Arizona State University, which was my university undergraduate in alma mater, and I intended to go to into law. And, you know, I wanted to learn more about the relationship between science and law. So that actually led me to a degree in bioethics. And Arizona State University has been mired in the after effects of the Havasupai lawsuit and controversy. And if you don't know what this lawsuit is, it's basically Arizona Board of Regents researchers at the two state universities in Arizona State and U of A, there's a huge lawsuit, and that data was being collected, and blood samples from those data were being collected from members of the Havasupai tribe, which lives at the base of the Grand Canyon. And they were broadly consented for use of those samples. And the community members thought that the samples were going to be used to study type 2 diabetes, and ended up that their data was being used potentially for other publications related to like schizophrenia and accusations of incest and, you know, and migration theories, origin narratives that are different from their own. And, you know, this really led to a whole trickle effect on top of all the other calls of cessations of genetics research in indigenous communities worldwide, such that many nations in the U.S. established moratoria on genetics research. And in many cases, those moratoria still are in place 17 plus years later. And I was really fascinated about the after effects of this genetic controversies in our communities. And even then, I started to understand that the newest boundary that's going to occur is going to be in the intersection of genomics and data science. So my PhD is actually at Vanderbilt University, which is like the best and the worst place to do a degree in this field. I mean, I loved it. I was able to get a great bioinformatics training, biostatistical training in looking at large-scale genome-wide data sets linked with electronic health records, and looking at uterine fibroids in African-American women, which, you know, obviously there's a huge population in the South, but unfortunately, it's the worst place because Vanderbilt University is in the state of Tennessee, and they forcibly removed all of their indigenous nations further west. So for the community engagement component, you know, it was really hard to get that kind of training. And also, you know, there's this whole movement toward large-scale data sets. And I know because, you know, big data is the pervasive philosophy. You need large data sets across multiple ethnic cohorts in order to look at variations and novel variations contributing to disease. But when you think about what that means for small populations like our own, usually that means that we are either ignored, like we don't constitute a high enough sample size, and we're just fundamentally removed from these types of data sets, or they pull us together into one big strata to get that sample size. And then all of those unique associations that are at population-specific level, they're lost. They're lost due to mixed effects and population stratification issues. So for me, you know, amidst this big data era, I've been advocating back again for small data sets and really robust data sets that don't just look at genetics and clinical factors, but also environmental factors and also colonial factors contributing to disease, like structural barriers to healthcare that are rooted in racist ideologies, to be honest. And just so this is kind of my field now, is looking at small data sets, robust data sets, looking at other contributors of health, and also just really fundamentally assuring, you know, pushing this agenda of indigenous genomic data sovereignties, that genomic data and health data and data that's collected and derived from indigenous people should fundamentally benefit us. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Crystal, for sharing that. That was so helpful and useful information and your candid experience. Thank you. Lindsay.
Thanks for having me, Gary. I absolutely love listening to Crystal's story. When we had the opportunity to meet originally, and it just reminds me of why data analytics in the hands of women and people of color is so important. For those of you joining, my name is Lindsay. I'm in executive coordination at the Gates Foundation, serving on the Gender Equality Division, and I gravitate towards spaces that empower women. And so a lot of my journey has been finding out how to create the space that society tends to not naturally create for us. And so I graduated from Spelman many years ago. I'm a part of the Milgard Women's Initiative currently. And as I stated, I'm a part of the Gender Equality Division today. And I'm lucky, and I've had a lot of great experiences as a woman. I think some just from being clever, and some just because life has afforded me those opportunities. But I've also always had the opportunity to look back and go, well, why is it that these opportunities are afforded to me, and why aren't they normal for everybody else? And so in my path has predominantly been about creating paths for other people. And how do you get work done? And how do you better maximize the kind of quality of life that everyone deserves? That's not something special to me. That should be something special for everyone. And so my path has predominantly been about trying to understand how to utilize data, because it's become very clear, especially where I sit professionally today, that data makes a lot of those decisions. And so if you understand how to leverage data to articulate a story, from not only your lived experience, but also knowing statistically what you're talking about, and to really force not just the same old story, but force forward the insights of new stories, of new perspectives, of lives that comprise this entire world we live in. And so that's my thought about it. Those are some of the barriers that I've noticed, and that's definitely what my path in this analytics community is all about.
Thank you, Lindsay, for sharing that. Aaron.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. This is awesome. Hearing all these great stories about your paths. And well, I feel like I'm going to overshare, but oh well. I'm originally from Compton, California. And during the time that I grew up, it's like any community, there are good people and bad people. And it just so happens that when I grew up there's a lot of gang violence, a lot of threats of, drive-bys and, the drugs. And, when my mom, I was raised by a single mom. My dad popped in every once in a while. I'm a first gen grad, bachelor and master's degree. And I was in my early ages, I was in a gifted and intelligent program in school, had these little flashes of brilliance. But the opportunities just wasn't there. When I was in school, the things that were emphasized was sports and music. And I know it's changed a little bit, but it just wasn't in my head to pursue a career in data science. It wasn't instilled in me at an early age, even though I seemed to have a knack for it. And then also coupled with that, there was like a survival mentality that I had to maintain. And a survival mentality is like you have to focus on your surroundings and know where you are, the graffiti on the wall, what people are wearing. Do you recognize that car? Do you know the people in that car? Well, okay, and then having a plan of action if something happens, where you're gonna run, or you'll fight or flight, that kind of thing. And you're constantly on edge. So the day-to-day is more survival than planning for success or the future. And then when I joined the military, which was probably the best decision I ever made, but it was one of very few options that I had at the time. They reinforced that survival mentality of how to survive, and how to fight. And then when my career began to take off, I brought that survival mentality with me in the early years of my career, where, and mostly because of being the only African-American male, even at all in these spaces, I felt this tremendous pressure to perform, and that I was representing my whole entire race to these, to these people. And that if I failed, I'd be failing not just myself, but I'd be failing like everyone. And I just perceived also that I didn't have, I guess what I'm saying is many of the barriers that I had were psychological, and because of the mentality that I brought into the space. And I perceived that that I didn't have the right or the freedom to be my authentic self in this space. Like I did things like I started talking, I changed the way, I wasn't allowed, I always smiled, I was happy. I didn't want to make anyone feel bad. So I always smiled, you don't want the Black guy to be mad. I also, when they had Friday Jeans Day, where you wore jeans, I didn't allow I had always looked professional. And then I talked like Kermit the Frog, I didn't bring in, how some people from the South, they'll bring in their y'all and this and all that. I didn't bring in any of that so that I wouldn't destroy my credibility with my colleagues. And then also there's this perception that no matter what I did to develop myself and to better myself, that I would never be at the level that they thought I should be. And these things were and even other African Americans that I ran into, we put on our masks, around everyone else. But then when we got together, we took our masks off and we started having these conversations and about our experiences, and they were very similar as far as the bias and how come when we're new and we ask a question, the response is as if we don't know anything at all. How come when you're new and you make a mistake, that little simple mistake that anyone would make when they're new, it's treated like it's a catastrophe, and they feel like, oh, why are we hiring them? Why are these people telling me, hey, do you know any other African Americans that are looking for a job? Because we were lucky to get you because, they don't test very high. Why would, those kind of things. And so I overcame these psychological barriers by focusing my energy on the things that I could control. And that was, I could control how I felt about myself. I got away from that survival mentality. Instead of looking for a safe space outside of me, I found it on the inside and started saying, hey, I may not know this, but I can learn, and I started getting my education and developing myself and applying for opportunities that I felt I was qualified for. And that has worked for me.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, everyone, for sharing their candid experiences and stories. And thank you for being so open and honest. This is truly inspiring. All right, let's move on to the next question. And what, according to you, or according to your research, is at stake in this emerging field when racial and gender composition of data scientists don't match up with the population? How does bias in data science applications affect the society, and what could be the impact of continued discrimination through these models and algorithms in the future? Jessica?
I think one of the most dangerous things that happens is you get sort of a test to fit model starting to happen. So you might find that you can fit, a data set to align by using 91 inputs, right? And that might predict that, Black males who are born on a Tuesday tend to have 1 foot larger than the other, but it doesn't mean anything, right? So it can be like, I'm seeing Aaron laugh. It's like, can become a new framework for like really stupid racist assumptions that don't make any sense. So I think if you don't have people, we had one model that's the example, it had 91 inputs. This is so great. This is going to tell you, exactly how likely the patient is to die. Well, if you look at the doctor and nurse treating the patient and you ask them, or you use an extremely simple algorithm with maybe like, I call it regular eye. Like we don't even need AI, we just need normal common sense. It usually actually performs better and it's less likely to have bias, right? So I guess the other point I would say to that, and I was listening to Aaron's story too, is, there was something that Michelle Obama said in her documentary recently, which is the people at the table, they don't even know how they got there. They don't know. They're nothing special. And I loved it when she said that, because I think That has happened so many times to me where I walk into a room and there are choices on where to sit, right? Like there's the main table, which looks scary, and then there's like in the corner. Never sit in the corner. Take the best seat you can take, even if it makes you uncomfortable. Sit down, be present, you know, and I think also when, in terms of the data part, when there are outputs from the data, I think it's extremely important that every person look at it through an equity lens. So like, I'm a white lady, right? But I'm also a foster parent. My dad was a public defender and I help run a free clinic. So I might look like I wouldn't be interested in those issues, but for me, the privilege of being in that space is that I can be a huge pain in the butt and I can push harder and get away with it than other people. So if they say, okay, here's this data set and I think we should market this service to neighborhoods with high home ownership, I can say, you know, that's interesting, but I feel like that's intrinsically racist. Can we talk about how that will mean that the patients who are actually sick will not be reached by this initiative, right? I think you have to be unafraid to come out and say that. And I think, you know, as long as you're respectful and you come at it from a place of curiosity, especially white people, I think you can get away with a lot.
That's so honest. Thank you so much for sharing that, and definitely so helpful. Crystal?
Oh, so this is a message that has been told to us about large-scale diversity projects to Indigenous peoples. And the message that researchers have given to Indigenous communities over and over again is, if you are not part of these data sets, you will miss out on the benefits of precision medicine and health. Let's examine that for a little bit and understand how this comes from a very biased and privileged viewpoint, and it's actually coercive. So there are reasons why Indigenous peoples have opted out, some of them, from genomics research due to recent historical harms, right? This is not something that is, you know, several decades ago. This is within the past 10 to 20 years and even ongoing. That Indigenous biomarkers that have been collected from our peoples were collected under questionable informed consent, broad consent, from really vulnerable populations in Central and South America. And sometimes we wonder if they were even consented in their Indigenous language. Now those biomarkers are now openly available for, of course, the benefit of humanity and also science, but it's also accessible to for-profit companies like Ancestry DNA and 23andMe. So when you have a test that estimates Native American ancestry, they're not calling on U.S. Indigenous biomarkers because U.S. tribes have opted out. They're calling on these exploited biomarkers that have been collected from unprotected peoples. And yet Ancestry, you know, until they were bought out for like $6 billion, you know, would make $1 billion profit every holiday quarter, you know. And their number one question, according to their blog, is, why isn't my Native American ancestry showing up? So questions about biopiracy and biocommercialism are really at the forefront of our concerns. And they've never been addressed. And we've gone back and forth. We went from broad consenting to like study informed consent, and then we decided that was too laborious for the harmonization and collection of data. So now we're going to broad consent, but we haven't actually addressed those issues at play that cause those harms to begin with. And now on top of that, we're giving a message, oh, Indigenous peoples, you're going to miss out on these next advances. It's going to be effectively your fault. This is now victim blaming. But we haven't addressed those same concerns. And let's talk about, too, you know, the lack of the overselling of the promise of precision medicine, and that we're not addressing the real factors related to structural health. So in 2018, we discovered that spending for each Native American patient was 2.5 times lower than the same amount of spending for the healthcare of each patient per capita, right? So imagine that when COVID hit and it disproportionately affected our community, it wasn't necessarily due to biological differences, or wasn't actually at all due to biological differences between peoples. It was due to the fact that we couldn't access healthcare when we have hundreds of miles to traverse just to get to adequate preventative health? So one of the things that I, of course, caution, and this is, of course, balanced with clinical testing, we don't have enough Indigenous-specific variants for the test to be of use to Indigenous populations. So that's something that we're going to have to address for sure. But the other thing that needs to be addressed is the collection of markers by companies like Color and who have commercial interest in these things. And we really need to talk about benefit sharing and talking about returning benefits to communities that provide this data. So we want to talk about bias and discrimination and missingness. We also have to describe equity. And that's why I want to say that, you know, inclusion without equity is just using inclusion as a guise for PR, for public relations, for the collection of data. So we want to really say not about us without us and talk more about data equity when we're talking about bias and discrimination in terms of the lack of representation in these data sets. And that's a really forefront in justice. And I hope that's something that we take forward with us moving forward in the field.
Thank you, Krista. I was curious about those ancestry DNA testing and got one done, but now I'm shocked about knowing what goes behind it. And also what a bold point about inclusion without equity comes to more bias in PR. Thank you for sharing that. Lindsay.
Thank you. And just a high five about the PR/DEI. That can't be overemphasized enough. I also want to hammer home, this will be a little bit of a nerd moment for Gary and I as we're finishing up text mining, like what the big picture of that data mining loop actually is. So for those who have context and don't have context, just to walk through what that structurally looks like, because Jessica and Crystal have given you a lot of good information about how, like real life applications about how that all manifests through this data loop. But you and I on this call are sensors, and what we express turns into text data. So you're writing on your Facebook, you're writing your blogs, you're writing whatever, you're speaking to each other, you're raising your children, you become teachers, you go through your communities and you express these things, they get captured. We're in a very real world where even everything we're saying today is recorded, everything, right? It gets together, it gets joined together. Then there's these predictors that come out of that. And based on who's actually doing all of this and who these sensors are and who is actually informing these predictive models, there's certain truths that then are manifested into our very real world. Like the loop is you as a sensor talk, express, what you're talking about gets mined, predictors get generated, those go into predictive models to predict your behavior, your outcomes. And then those predicted values get fed into the real world and then they change it. That's what the big data mining loop is. And so when we talk about what's at stake here, when we feed all of that, when we're expressing these things from our perspectives that as humans are inherently biased, and we don't emphasize inclusion in our worlds, we don't emphasize understanding that there is more than just the United States, that there's more than just men, doctors and teachers and lawyers, that African Americans and brown people and everybody belong in data analytics. It is not just this hierarchical community by which only one set of persons can contribute. When you do those things, it changes the way the world moves. And so when we ask what's at stake here, for me, the two things that pop out immediately is the safety of our minority communities. I mean, Gary, you started with your introduction about what that looks like when there's inferences made based on these mining techniques or these algorithms that are created based on bad data, badly inferred data. It changes the way that the world then perceives these communities. So it's our brothers and sisters of color, it's our trans brothers and sisters, it's our friends and family with disabilities, how the world interacts with them because of how you talk, because of how you write, because of how you think, because of how we're socialized. It impacts the safety of those communities. They are more likely to be harmed because of how those things are inferred, because you and I aren't in those rooms. We're not in those decision-making processes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why it's very important for us to be here today and going to school and learning how to make tables and chairs by which we sit and have these conversations if we're not invited to them. And then the last point that I wanted to make, it is akin to the safety of these communities, but very particularly for women and women of color, is data also is of leverage to policymaking. And so I just wanted to make sure to emphasize that as we're seeing these laws enacted about, complete bans of abortion and women who, could die while giving birth, or all kinds of other things besides just behavior. And, there's morality politics that are laden in that we won't get into, but there's policy that goes into this. The data says that, if women have access to this, they'll behave badly, which is completely insane. But just to say, data feeds these kind of policies. And Crystal hit on this. It hits at a policy that changes the way the world relates with women, but it doesn't get at the structural issues around it. So, so it completely misses women who don't even get sex education or can't get contraceptives, can't get to clinics, have never learned what it means to protect yourself, don't have the right per religious reasons to protect themselves. So when you don't have this larger context feeding these algorithms, these predictive models, you're missing so much of what actually is the truth. You're missing the real point. And so what's at stake is you're missing the real point. And so you're missing real people and you're putting them in danger.
Yeah. Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you so much. That was very interesting. It reminded me of the Social Dilemma documentary, how we are controlled with that data. Try to keep my content minimum and contribute the least to all of this. But you mentioned a really great point about it's not just about race, equity, about being women. It's more to that. There's more to that. The LGBTQ community, the disabled community, and also about the impact. It's from top bottom, right? So we have to be proactive wherever we are getting these opportunities to speak up, to take these actions towards equitable opportunities and inclusiveness. Thank you. Aaron.
Awesome. Wow. I feel like I'm in church. This is awesome. You guys have made some awesome points. I'm just going to keep mine short and sweet. And I think what's at stake is just like a huge opportunity to make an impact. Like historically, people of color have made significant contributions in the domain of math and science. And, I wasn't really taught about these people. I had to discover them on my own later in life, about Dr. Daniel Hill Williams and, Benjamin Banneker and all these other names. And, but, even more recently, like Dr. Shirley Ann Jackson, the first African-American female to get her doctorate degree from MIT. I just feel like that's what's at stake. It's just an opportunity for women and people of color just to make a huge and significant contribution as we have in the past. And, and just to hear more of those stories, where it isn't just history, it's current events as well.
Thank you, Aaron. So I know we all touched on these points a little bit, but to more emphasize it, what is in our hands to make this data and its application anti-racist? What can data scientists or us as data professionals do to address these disparities?
Yeah, I think a couple things about that. From a healthcare perspective, I think remembering that 90% of your health is not healthcare. I mean, I'm appreciative I have a job, but 90% has nothing to do with me, right? So like 10%, you've got a yeast infection or something, I'll help you. But most of the time, we're talking about structural economic inequalities, right? I mean, I think at the beginning of creating data and at the end of interpreting data and everywhere in between, thinking about Ibram Kendi would say, like, thinking about at every moment whether what you're putting in is coming in from a standpoint of thinking how that affects different people, right? and having the courage to say like, I think one of our customers, they say, let's have an equity moment, right? But I think it's more like when you're creating a model, it's also the intention of what you put into it is very important. You know, there's been a lot of weaponizing of data, I would say. You know, once patients arrive in the hospital, if you control for economic measures and sicknesses that they already have, outcomes between race are actually the same. So I think sometimes saying like, oh, it's all social determinants of health, that also to me is victim blaming. It's saying that there's something intrinsically wrong with people of a certain race that means that they die more often, which is kind of a cheap trick. It's kind of an easy answer, but it's not true, right? So if there's not something intrinsically wrong with a certain group, then it means that there are other factors that are causing them to die more often. We as a society don't like to think about economic inequality, but if you actually take that out, it takes out, I mean, I'd be interested in what the other people say, but I think it would take out most of the difference, right? But we can talk about like, okay, we're gonna hire one person of color. Well, that doesn't mean that we address the fact that we don't care for everyone equally, right? Mm-hmm. So like at our free clinic, there's all kind of diversity. Actually, they're all white, but there's lots of diversity in terms of economics, right? And if you put up a barrier that you make someone sign in and give their personal information, some will just walk right out, and they're the patients you need the most. And so I think especially requiring people to put in really personal data creates an intrinsic bias, you know, from the beginning. But I would just say, yeah, at every stage, thinking about whether the piece of data you're using is actually like a core true piece of data, right? Or if it's a surrogate for really an economic disparity. Because there ends up, you know, there's lots of things, oh, well, you know, Black people don't really want to be vaccinated. Right? That's data driven, Erin, I can tell you, right? So it has to do with how you, I love the fact that now I feel like our society is ready to have those conversations, right? And when I went to volunteer to give vaccines and I would get a 95-year-old Black lady who sat down, I could have a little bit of understanding of why she may not be comfortable, right? But I think data, while it's hugely powerful, is very easy to mislead, you know? Yeah.
I'm having so many of those aha moments, hearing all your stories and insights. Thank you so much for sharing this. Crystal.
So in genetics, there's this huge problem that we've had in the field historically and also currently, in that we too simply biologicize race. Like we are just like looking at race in terms of biological factors, and that leads to so many issues rooted in racism that are harmful and discriminatory, and also ultimately lead to poor assumptions about our peoples and our health. So like my friend and colleague, Yalu Fox, he talks about just so stories. And these are like really reductive narratives about population-specific variants. And this is really important because when you think about what the goal of genomic and precision medicine is, which is to look at new variants related to that could be predictive of health, all of the lowest hanging fruit has already been picked, right? The common variants that lead to common disease, they've already been investigated. Variants that are Mendelian have been long investigated. What's of interest are rare variants in populations that have been, you know, like ours, like indigenous people, small, underrepresented. Sometimes we're called the last frontier or like the source of hidden variation. There have been large-scale diversity projects whose goals were to sample us before we, quote, vanished or disappeared, highlighting the racism in the field already. But we're also we're looking for rare variations in populations that are already disempowered, thus continuing that cycle of exploitation. But we're also reducing people's characterizations to biology And that can lead to, possibly deadly decisions as well. So what I advocate is like looking at other covariates that might be more predictive of health disparities, like the structural barriers, like the colonial factors, and also just educating researchers and other peoples in the public. We want to promote that indigeneity as more based on culture and kinship, and not necessarily biological kinship at that as well. It's a social and political distinction. And that's something that I aim to talk about in the media as much as I can. Like, for instance, with the whole Elizabeth Warren controversy, her presidential platform and her announcement to run for president was tied with her supposed link to a Native American background. And, the assumptions underlying that test was by, a top geneticist at Stanford University, who's given the MacArthur Genius Award too, that perpetuated that type of research. So it's really important for members of the community to be vocal and be present and counteract these narratives, especially when these assumptions and these stereotypes are held against us. And it's really important for us to be there to counter it and hopefully redirect the conversation to mobilize change where action needs to be changed.
Thank you, Krista. Lindsay?
So I think that what I would advocate most is just continue to be diligent in challenging data and really seek to understand it. It's not just, and that's no easy feat as we're matriculating through this program. It's not as easy as sliding in a CSV into Tableau and seeing what correlates. There's a lot more to it. There's a lot of research that goes into it. There's so much reading that is absolutely necessary. And again, as I think I stated probably in the first question that you asked, Gary, is it's not about just illuminating the same story. Like no one would be asking anyone in data analytics, well, they should not be asking anyone in data analytics to just reaffirm the same tale. Like, how boring is that? The point is to unearth something new, something else, another part of our humanity that needs to be addressed. And so I would just continue to advocate that you challenge it, really know your stuff, really read, and really adapt that forever learner mentality. I also would say, from a tactical standpoint, all of us have power in creating space for each other. All of our voices are very needed in these meetings where we are forming opinions, we are making decisions, we are executing on those decisions. And we have, I think, a lot of power in making sure that we advocate for voices that are elbow to elbow with us, or those voices that aren't in the room. And so I think very tactically, just always continue to push to make space. Diversity takes space. And so if we're going to acknowledge it and continue to make it a staple in how data analytics are performed, we need to make space for it.
Thank you, Lindsay. That was very thoughtful of you. Aaron.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just gonna kind of piggyback off of what Lindsay shared. Just in our analysis of data, we can sometimes unintentionally introduce bias. Like when we sample, I was doing a study on a COVID outreach, and they were selecting their cohorts based on risk scores. And when you do that and you don't pay attention to the racial breakdown, you could arrive at certain conclusions that exclude certain groups, people of color. And so I'm just thinking, maybe something as simple as using Simpson's diversity index or something, just to analyze the cohorts to see, is the diversity level consistent, in the control group into each cohort, just to ensure that that's maintained, throughout, and that, things are divided appropriately in the data.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Being respectful of everyone's time, we do have some questions in the chat, and I also have one last question, and I think they kind of answer the same point. So the question goes like, have you faced macro or microaggressions in your industry, and how did you deal with that? Were there any consequences for the people who perpetuated macro or microaggressions? I'm a STEM major about to graduate, and having faced these issues as a minority woman in STEM, I have constant thoughts of leaving STEM completely due to these issues and feeling like I don't belong in STEM spaces. And my question was, what is the one final key takeaway from today's discussion for audience, which can be a stepping stone, a starting point towards equitable and inclusive data science and analytics? And basically, you can answer this with what can we do at this moment, and what have you done at this moment or coming all along to navigate these challenges? Jessica.
Well, that's a nice big question. Thank you. I'm probably the least qualified person on the panel to talk about micro or macro aggression. So I guess just I would say that in terms of overall take-home points, you know, there have been times in my career for sure when I felt like what I was trying to do didn't belong. And I got to a point probably 5 years ago where I was really thinking about health equity and feeling stuck. And then I thought, you know what? I didn't make a decision to refuse to become discouraged. I just refuse. You know, if you just lay down on the ground, then the devil doesn't even have to do any work because you're not even going to get up, right? So I think it might, for me, it took being, you know, getting to a place psychologically where I felt pretty low to think like, okay, I'm not taking this attitude one step further, right? Like I refuse to be discouraged. The other thing I was thinking about while some were talking too is that everyone else at the table does not feel safe and they do not feel competent. And if you wait until you feel safe and competent and you have your full armor on, then you won't show up for your team. And I say to my team all the time, hey, I don't know how to do this, but if you could help me and just have pity on me because I'm just a doctor, I don't understand. You know, there's lots of things that they do, you know, the nursing staff and the people who do staffing for our hospitals that I'm never going to understand. But if you can come at them with humility and be willing to not feel safe and not feel competent, that's when you really start to learn. I guess the last part is our mission control has been open at Franciscan for 2 years. And some of the things we initially tried to do in terms of really advocating for our patients initially seemed impossible. And we just started to do them. And we started to use language like, our standard is blank. This is how we do business. And it wasn't true at all in the beginning. And then we just kept saying it. And eventually we started hearing it back. Well, actually, I'm pretty sure this company standard is, you know, this particular thing. And it's just because we had persisted in that, right? We had said, this is the way it's going to be. And I think when you're protecting patients, especially, that's really important, but it didn't have anything to do with asking permission. I'm a huge fan of not asking any question that you don't want an answer to. If you can just make the change and move ahead, ride the pony, see how far you can get. And I would encourage everyone to do that, you know, as often as possible.
Thank you, Jessica. That's really a breakthrough way of getting at things. Crystal.
No, thank you. It's a good question. Microaggressions and it's something I've encountered all throughout all my stages of my career, and it never gets easier. It never does. And macroaggressions occur even at the systemic level, unfortunately, just in terms of the way that policy decisions are made without us, but, you know, involving us and disempowering us. And it really takes a lot of courage in order to stand up to that, especially when you're in academia or even in industry where you're an early stage person in your career phase and you're trying to call these practices out. That's really difficult. And it's hard to do when you are underrepresented in your institution. And the major thing that has been my driving factor for success is finding a community of individuals that feel the same way. And they never become our colleagues and our co-conspirators, and we work on the same projects together, and we feed off of each other, and that's a really positive experience, actually. And in terms of, you know, I have a lot of projects, our community-based, and they're related to genomics, of course, but the thing that I'm most passionate about, and I'm really happy to see come to fruition, is this workshop that I've helped co-create, which is called Indigidata, the Indigenous Data Science Education Workshop this summer. It's actually in like a little over a week, actually. And it's just a workshop to build a community and train up-and-coming Indigenous data scientists in whatever field that they might decide to do. And so that we can just create the role models that we wish we had growing up. And the field is calling for, we're starting to have more and more people from our communities up and coming who can take the helm. And it's more about encouraging them and empowering ourselves as a whole. And if we can find that in our own communities and replicate that, I think that just bringing the positivity forward is just a great driving factor.
Thank you. Lindsay.
Such a good question. As everyone has said, it's microaggressions, aggressions. We've all dealt with them. And I think the best lesson learned that I have been able to formulate in my time on Earth is do what you need to do anyway. There are people who you'll never convince, and that's okay. I think there is a certain level of orientation one must have when your goal is to break down barriers. And one of those places of orientation just has to be, you can't do this for applause. It can't be about being able to rattle off like, you know, some statistical formula. It's about doing something for the impact. And I think one has to be truly steeped in that orientation and do what you have to do anyway, because your communities that you are embedded in and communities you aren't embedded in will benefit. And so do it anyway.
Thank you, Lindsay. That's a great piece of advice. Aaron.
All right, I need to be careful because I have some tea to share. I got to make sure I don't say too much. But yes, I have experienced both micro and macroaggressions. And let's just say I'm not, you got to choose your battles, so to speak. But I'm not one to avoid those hard conversations. And what I look for, I'm not a touchy person. Like, I don't walk around with a chip on my shoulder, and I'm not gonna define this new experience based on my past experiences with other individuals. But when I see a pattern of behavior, I'll have a conversation with someone and address and say, hey, this happened, and you're doing this, and this is how this made me feel, and we'll have a conversation. I'll do that. And then if we can't resolve it that way, then I'll just escalate from there, not to violence, more like leadership, those kind of things. And but as far as a takeaway, I would say, I think about like a buffet, like, you know, you go to like Golden Corral or wherever buffet you would go to, and you walk in and you see all these other people, you got your first plate, and all these other people are on their third or fourth plate. They've been eating for all this time, you just getting started. Mm-hmm. And, you know, and when I scroll through LinkedIn, I see all these, you know, these people, this is the first woman who's done this, or this is the first African-American that's done this. And it's always something that someone else has been doing for years. Like we're just now doing it. And I think we're getting to the place of equity when we see these firsts, it's not what has been done, but it's something that has never been done. That I think we're getting to the right place in data science and just in general, when we scroll through and these firsts that we're reading aren't, you know, this has never been done before, and it was done by this person of color.
Thank you, Aaron. I am myself a first generation graduate woman and can relate to that totally. We have come to our time, NCR, and it has been a wonderful discussion. I would love to continue this, but we have to have a hard stop. And thank you so much for being here. Thank you for taking out time from your schedules and being here, sharing your thoughts, your work. And to the audience, I would like to request a call for action. Do whatever is in your area and limits or in your area of work possible to disrupt, make big breakthroughs. And also, even if it's just spreading awareness or even educating yourself, go ahead and learn more about this topic. And I would encourage also people to come more into this field of data and analytics and data science. And we would together be helping the community and world to avoid this bias. With that, I would like to sign off and thank you so much for being here again.
Thank you, Gary.
Bye-bye.